Hi, today I'm going to be reading to you from chapter 11 in Alas, Babylon. Elizabeth McGovern and Randolph Bragg were married at noon that Easter Sunday. The bride wore the same white silk dress she had worn to the sunrise service in Marines Park. She was unsteady on high heels, for she had not worn heels since the day. The groom wore his Class A uniform with the bold patch of the 1st Cavalry Division on his arm and the ribbons of the Korean War and bronze star on his chest, along with the blue badge of the combat infantrymen. He wore the uniform not because of the wedding, but because it was required in the radioed orders to reservists assuming active duty, such as ambushing and killing highwaymen, which he presently intended to do. The bride was given away by her father, W. Foxworth McGovern, the retired Cleveland manufacturer, and Bill McGovern, who had been helping Malachi cut gun ports in the thin steel sides and rear doors of the grocery truck, wore greasy dungarees. A chisel had slipped and one of his hands was bleeding. The best man was Dr. Daniel Gunn, and he was clad in a tent-sized striped bathrobe and grinning through his red beard, his head bandaged, a square gauze patch covering his right eye. He looked like a turbaned Mediterranean pirate. Among the guests were Rear Admiral Samuel P. Hazard, USN, retired, who wore khaki shorts, a khaki hunting vest bulging with buckshot shells, and during the ceremony held his gold-braided cap across his stomach. The matron of honor was Mrs. Helen Bragg, the presumed widow of Colonel Mark Bragg. She furnished the wedding ring, stripping it from her own finger. The ceremony was held in the high-ceilinged parlor of the Bragg home, and the marriage was performed by the Reverend Clarence Henry, pastor emeritus of the Afro Repose Baptist Church. Randy was certain it was perfectly legal. It was performed under the order number 4, written that morning in Sam Hazard's house. Malachi and Bill McGovern had been working on the truck, and Randy was breakfasting with Dan Gunn when the women and children returned from Marines Park. The services had been wonderful, they said, but the news they brought was terrible. During the night, the highwaymen had raided the isolated house of Jim Hickey, the beekeeper, on the Pasco Creek Road. They had killed Jim and his wife. The 2 children had walked to Fort Repose and found their aunt's house. Whether it was the same band that had beaten Dan Gunn was uncertain. The Hickey children were inarticulate and hysterical with fear and shock. Randy, raging for immediate retaliation, had raced to the Admiral's house with the news. The Admiral's experience in meeting the unpredictable and brutish pranks of war had saved them from premature or imprudent action. "Wasn't this exactly the sort of thing that you had expected?" Sam Hazard asked. "I suppose so, but damn it! I don't think that we should change our plan by so much as a minute. If we put out with the truck now, we'll just burn fuel for nothing. Those people operate like beasts, Randy. Having gorged themselves in the night, they sleep through the mornings, perhaps through the whole day." Randy, recognizing the sense of this, had calmed himself, and they had talked of the wedding and the legal problems attending martial law, and the Admiral had helped him in framing Order Number 4. And it read, until county offices resume operations and normal communications are reestablished between this town and the Timucuan County seat, the following regulations will govern marriages and births in Fort Repose. 1. Marriages can be performed by any ordained minister, and marriage licenses and health certificates are waived. 2. Marriage certificates will be issued by the presiding minister and will be valid when signed by the contracting parties, the minister and 2 witnesses. So, number 3, so that a permanent record may be preserved, a copy of the certificate will be kept at the Fort Repose Library, and I designate librarian Alice Cooksey custodian of these records, and I designate Ms. Florence Wiechek her deputy. 4. Birth records signed by the attending physician or midwife or by the mother and any witnesses, if medical attention is unavailable, will be deposited in the same manner. And 1 copy of this order is to be kept within the records in the library. This order is retroactive to the day so that any births or marriages that have occurred since the day may be properly recorded. Randy signed order number 4 and said, well, when the rules are off, you make your own. Again, Randy appointing Alice Cooksey and Florence Wiechek to be in charge, or the custodians of keeping the records, again, elevates their status. As I've been reminding you guys all along while we've been reading, look at how the characters were before the day and look at how the characters are after the day. So again, Alice Cooksey has found more purpose in her role as librarian, and while Florence Wiechek was important before managing the Western Union, she has now maintained her importance in Fort Repose, but maybe just her job has shifted as she is now helping Alice. This is a good one, Sam Hazard said. I wonder what they're doing elsewhere. Elsewhere? There must be hundreds of towns in the same fix we're in. Local authority collapsed or inoperative. Communications out. I fancy that elsewhere they're not doing so good. How could they be worse? Randy said, thinking of what had happened to Dan Gunn and the Hickeys. They could be, the Admiral said positively. Randy had gone to see Preacher next. Preacher, he said, you're an ordained minister, aren't you? Oh, I gotta flip the page. I sure am, Preacher said. I am not only the ordained minister in my church, but I can ordain people. Would you mind marrying Miss McGovern and me? We don't have a regular courthouse license, naturally, but I have fixed it up to make it legal under martial law. Miss McGovern told me that you was going to wed, Mr. Randy, and I will be happy to marry you. I don't need papers. I've joined maybe 1,000 pairs in my life. Some had papers, some didn't, some stuck, some didn't. The papers didn't make the difference. It's the people, not the papers. So they were married in a room filled with flowers of the season and furniture of less bitter centuries and people of all ages. Randy produced the certificate, and when Preacher signed it, he signed Reverend Clarence Henry. And Randy realized that this was the first time he had ever known Preacher's full name, although the Preacher had always been there. Randy had found a large-scale county map in his desk, and they had planned their movements as carefully as a cruise ship captain plotting his course through Submarine Alley. There were 4 roads that led out from Fort Repose. River Road stretched east along the Timucuan until it swung onto a main highway to the beaches. The Pasco Creek Road ran north, the San Marco Road west from the bridge across the St. Johns, and a narrow, substandard road followed the St. Johns towards its headwaters. The map, with 2 crosses to mark where the highwaymen had stopped Dan Gunn and killed the Hickeys, lay on the garage floor. They bent over it, Randy tracing the route that they would take. The highwaymen could be anywhere. This could be One band, they could be one band, or two, or more. They could be gone entirely. It was all guesswork, and yet it was necessary to plan the route so as to cover the most territory, using the last amount of gas, for when the truck tank was empty. That would be all. There was no reserve, not anywhere. They would take River Road first because it was closest. After 12 miles, a little used lateral fed towards Pasco Creek Road, and they would go almost to Pasco Creek and then cut into the rural road for Fort Repose. Thus, by using the clay or washboard laterals, they could avoid retracing the same highway and save a few miles. On his hands and knees, his seagoing cap pushed back on his pink head, the Admiral murmured, "Give me a fast ship, for I intend to go into harm's way." Paul Jones. "Remember, Randy, this should be a very slow ship. The slower we go, the less gas we use, and the more chance they have of spotting us." Randy was going to drive. Malachi, Sam Hazard, and Bill McGovern were to be concealed in the body of the truck. Randy said, "I don't like to drive slow, but I can." "I think about 20 miles an hour is right. Anything slower would look suspicious." He checked the weapons. They were taking everything that might be handy. The automatic 16 for the Admiral and the double 20 for Bill McGovern. Malachi would have the carbine. The big Krag, long as a Kentucky squirrel rifle and as unwieldy, would be in reserve. From Dan's description of how the highwaymen had acted, Randy guessed that the firefight, when it came, would be close in and the shotguns of greater value than the rifles. He himself alone behind the wheel would only have the .45 automatic on the seat behind him. That and the hunting knife, which was almost, but not quite, razor sharp, in a sheath at his belt. Randy walking along the truck for a final look. He thought he was doing something that was familiar, and then he remembered that he had seen aircraft commanders do the same thing before takeoff. He examined the tires, and they were good. The battery water had been replenished and the battery run up. Malachi and Bill had done a good job on the gun ports, fairing them into the big painted letters, Ajax Supermarket. On each side, one port in the J and one in the M, camouflage. The holes cut into the rear doors under the tiny glass windows were more conspicuous. Randy went outside and returned with a handful of mud. He spread it on the edges of the ports, erasing the glint of the freshly cut metal. It was 4 o'clock, the time to sortie. "You know your positions," he said. "Sam, you have the starboard side. Bill takes the port. Malachi the stern. If I see you fire, it can't be effective from inside, and I'll yell out, and then everybody gets out while I cover you." Then at the last second there was a change. Malachi suggested it. "Mr. Randy, I want to say something, and I don't think that you ought to drive. I think I ought to drive." Randy was furious, but he held his voice down. "Let's not get everything screwed up now. Come on, get in, Malachi." Malachi made no move. "Sir, that uniform, it don't go with the truck." "They won't see it until they stop us," Randy said, "and then it'll be too late. Anyway, all sorts of people are wearing all sorts of clothes. I'd bet you see a highwayman in uniform if they got their hands on one." "Well, that ain't all, sir," Malachi said. "It's your face. It's white. They're more likely to tackle a black face than a white face. They see my face, they say, Here's something soft and probably with no gun. And so they relax. It gives us that extra second, Mr. Randy. Randy hesitated. He had confidence in Malachi's driving and in his judgment and courage. But it was the driver who would have to do the talking, and if there was any talking, and who would have to keep his hands off the pistol. That would be the hardest thing. The Admiral spoke very carefully. Now, Randy, I am not trying to outrank you. You're the captain and you're in command and it's your decision. But I think Malachi is right. Dungarees and a black face are better than a uniform and a white face. Randy said, "Okay, you're right. You drive, Malachi. You take the pistol up front and keep it out of sight. There's only one thing to remember. When they stop us, they'll all be watching you. They don't know we're here, but they'll be watching you, and they'll kill you if you go for your gun. So you leave your gun alone until we start shooting." Malachi grinned and said, "Yes, sir," and they got in and departed. Looking through the glass in the rear door, Randy saw his wife and Helen and Dan on the porch, and they were waving. Peyton was there too, but she wasn't waving. She had her face buried in her mother's dress. They drove east on River Road, and after a few miles, Randy told Malachi to look for signs of the place where Dan Gunn had been decoyed and beaten. They found a sign, and since there was no longer any care of the roads, the grass had grown high on the shoulders. But in one place it was trampled. In a ditch nearby, they discovered slivers of broken glass. Then they found the twisted and empty frames of Dan's glasses. The frame was useless, and yet Randy picked it up and shoved it in his pocket. A lawyer's gesture, he thought. Evidence. They drove on past the Sunbury home. Randy was tempted to order a stop to inquire about the children's typhoid. Dan would want to know. He did not stop. The Sunburys were good people, and he trusted them. But the truck was a secret, a military secret, and he was senseless, and it would be senseless to expose it. River Road was clear. Nothing moved on River Road. They took the lateral north, even though Malachi avoided the worst potholes and drove with exasperating deliberation. It was rough riding. It shook up Bill McGovern and Sam Hazard. They were older, and they would tire. Near Pasco Creek, they passed a group of inhabited shacks. Approaching them, Malachi called back, "People." Randy turned and looked over Malachi's shoulder, and he could see from behind the front seat, but not be seen. And he saw two children scurry indoors, and at another place, a bearded man crouched behind a woodpile, training a gun on the truck. He made no hostile move, but the muzzle tracked him. It was obvious that few people traveled this road, and those who did were not welcome. Randy was relieved when they turned into the better road toward Fort Repose. They were all stiff by then, for it was impossible to stand upright in the panel truck. The Admiral and Bill could sit cross-legged on the floor and view the landscape through their ports. But Randy had to half crouch to see through the rear window. When the truck reached higher ground, where the road was straight, and they could not see anything approach for nearly a mile, he told Malachi to stop. "We'll take 10, he said. He threw open the back doors and got out, groaning, feeling permanently warped. He walked, waving his arms and flexing his knees. Bill McGovern shuffled down the road, humpbacked. The admiral tried to stretch, and a joint or tendon cracked audibly. He cursed. Malachi grinned. Now I see why you wanted to drive, Randy said. He looked both ways. Nothing was coming. He went back to the truck and found the thermos Lib had given him, and he opened it, expecting water, but it was sweetened black coffee. Look, he said. Look at what Lib, my wife, did for us. He knew it was the last of the jar. There was a cup for each, but they decided to take only half a cup, saving the rest for the tag end of the evening when they might need it a little bit more. They got back into the truck and continued the patrol past the Hickey house, empty doors open, windows wantonly smashed, and Randy noticed the beekeeper's car was gone. Jim Hickey, with such valuable trading goods as honey and beeswax, must have been holding gasoline. In the past month, anyone who had it would have traded it for honey. The objective of the highwayman was probably the car and the gas, Randy deduced, rather than the honey, and this conclusion disheartened him. The highwaymen might be hundreds of miles from Fort Repose now. Nearing Fort Repose, they must avoid being seen in the town. So, they turned off on a winding road, high-crowned clay road, that ran 2 miles to an antique covered bridge across the St. Johns. Once across the river, they would turn south and shortly thereafter hit the road to San Marco. Rattling over the clay washboard, it seemed hardly worthwhile to keep a watch from the back, and yet Randy did. Suddenly, he saw that they were being followed. He had seen no car on the Pasco Creek Road before making the turn. They had passed no car on the clay lateral, nor any houses either. The car was simply there. Following them at a respectable distance, making no effort to catch them, and yet not dropping back. It must have been concealed there. Randy called to Malachi so that Malachi could clearly hear. We've got company about 300 yards back. He strained his eyes through the dirty little rear windows. It was difficult to make them focus. He tried to train a gun from a bounce. It was like trying to train a gun from a bouncing Jeep, and it was almost dusk. It was a late model, light gray hardtop or sedan, and Jim Hickey had owned a car. Such a car, but all makes looked pretty much alike. And it seemed half of them were either light gray or off-white. He called to Malachi, "Speed up a little and see what happens." Malachi increased their speed to 40 or 45. The car behind them maintained its distance exactly as if it were tied to them, and this proved nothing. That would be standard operating procedure for an honest citizen following a strange truck on a lonely, unfrequented road. He wouldn't want to get too close, but he was probably in a hurry to get home before dark. So, if the truck sped up, he would too. "Drop back to 20, Randy ordered, and the truck slowed. So did the car. Again, this proved nothing except caution. Randy turned to Sam Hazard and Bill McGovern. "This fellow behind us is either an innocent bystander or he's hurting us." "Hurting us," Bill said. "Hurting us into the gun of some pal up front." They hit a smoother strip of road, and Randy could see 2 men in the car. He thought that the back was empty, but he couldn't be sure. 2 of them, both men. They rode on silently. This was entirely different from a patrol in a war when you went out in fear, and despite your fear, hoping you would find no trouble. His only fear was that they would miss them, exhaust their gas in futile cruising, and lose their one best chance to wipe them out. This was a personal matter and a matter of survival. It was like having a nest of coral snakes under the house. You had to go in after them and kill them, or certainly one day they would kill a child or your dog. In a matter such as this, the importance of your own life diminished. So he prayed that the men behind were highwaymen. In a minute or two, he knew that they were, because at the opposite end of the narrow covered bridge was blocked. They were herded into a cul-de-sac, and the tactical situation was changed and their plan now useless. There would be no field of fire from the side ports. And the rear, he said, keep going. They had to drive right into it. If they stopped short of the bridge and jumped out to make their fight at a distance, then the highwaymen could shoot and run. They had to get close in. Malachi kept going. Sam, you and Bill take the ones in the back, Randy said. I'll help Malachi in the front. Forget the sides. The Admiral and Bill crawled to the rear. Randy crouched behind Malachi's back. He checked the carbine. It was ready. He shifted an extra clip to his shirt pocket where it would be the handiest. The block at the opposite end of the bridge was their Model A. Its boxy profile unmistakable. A man stood and waited at each bumper. Randy could ram the car, or you could ram the car, but you could not ram the man, so this tactic wouldn't do any good. Randy recognized them from Dan's description. The one with the gorilla arms and the submachine gun stood at the front. The gun was a Thompson. The man with the bat was on the other side, and he carried a holstered pistol too. But from the way he hefted the bat, like a hitter eager to step to the plate, the bat was his weapon. 4 men then, instead of 3, and no woman. Understandable. The personnel of these bands probably changed from day to day. Right up to them, he told Malachi. Close. The wheels hit the first planks of the bridge, and Malachi slowed, and Randy saw the muzzle of the Thompson rise. This was the one he had to get. He pushed the butt of the carbine into Bill McGovern's ribs, and he said, let them come right up to you. Let them come right in with us if they want. We've got troubles up front. Bill nodded. The rhythmic timpani beat of tires on planks stopped. They were 20 feet from the Model A. The man with the bat advanced towards the left side of the truck. The Tommy gunner stayed where he was. In his light, Randy doubted that they could see anything in the truck body, but he did not stir. He was immobile as a sack, and he whispered, make the son of a bitch with the gun come to us. Make him move. Make him come. The man with the bat was 3 feet from Malachi and 5 feet from the carbine's muzzle. If he looked into the truck cab, Randy would have to shoot him, and in that case, the Tommy gunner might get them all. There was nothing more Randy could say or do. He could not even whisper. It was all up to Malachi now. The man whacked his bat viciously against the door. What you got in there, boy? I ain't got nothing, boss, Malachi whined. From the set of his right shoulder, Randy knew that Malachi had his right hand on the .45. But he was acting dumb and talking dumb, which was the way to do. The Tommy gunner moved a step closer and 2 steps to the right so he could observe Malachi. And he said, "Come on, Casey, get that dinge out here." The man with the bat said, "Step down, you black bastard." And Randy knew that the man couldn't use the bat while Malachi stayed in the truck. And he prayed Malachi would wait him out. And he watched the gunner. "Oh, please, God, make him take one more step so I won't have to try through the windshield." Shot through the windshield was almost certain to miss because of light refraction or bullet deflection. It would be foolhardy and desperate, and he wouldn't do it. The gunner said, "Drag him out or blow him out. I don't care which." Malachi cringed and cried, "Please, boss." The fear in his voice was real. The man with the bat put his hand on the door handle, and as the instant he turned it, Malachi uncoiled, hurling himself through the door and on him, pistol clubbed. The gunner took two quick steps, and the Thompson jerked and spoke. The gunner's thick muzzle was in Randy's sights, and he squeezed the trigger. And again, before the Thompson's muzzle came down, and the gunner folded and fell and began to fall. When he was on his face, he still twitched and held the gun and tried to swing it up. And Randy shot at him again, carefully, through the head. He had not even heard the shotgun, but when Randy looked over the front seat and got out, looking for another target, the battle was over. Close behind the truck, two figures lay, their arms and legs twisted in death's awkward signature. The admiral stood over the man who had held the bat, his shotgun a foot from his head. Malachi was curled as if in sleep, his head against the left front tire. It had not lasted more than 7 seconds. Malachi choked and groaned, and Randy dropped to his knees beside him and straightened him out and lifted his head. Malachi choked again, and Randy turned Malachi's head so that the blood could run out of his mouth and not down his windpipe. He tore open Malachi's shirt, and there was a large hole, as large as a dime, just under the solar plexus. In this round well, dark blood rose and ebbed rhythmically, a small, ominous tide. The admiral said, "Shall I get rid of this scum?" Randy said, "Just a minute," and he picked up the bat and forced himself to think ahead. First, Malachi. Get Malachi home in a hurry so Dan can do something if there was anything to be done. Dan didn't have his tools or much eyesight, and he might make do with one eye if he had the tools that these men had stolen. And Randy ran to the Model A, but it was empty and the doctor's bag wasn't there. He walked to the back of the truck where Sam Hazard stood over their captive. One side of the man's face was scraped raw. Malachi's plunge had carried the long-jawed, twisted mouth face along the bridge's planking. "Where's the doctor's bag?" The man said nothing, and Randy saw his right hand moving. He still had a holstered weapon. "Keep your hand still." The admiral leaned over, unbuckled the holster, and took the weapon. A .38 police special. "Talk," Randy said. The man said, "I don't know nothing." Randy tapped his face with the bat. Harder. The man screamed, and Randy said, "Where's the black bag?" The man said, "She took it. Rum-Dum took it." "Where is she?" "I don't know. She goofed off with somebody last night. Maybe it was this morning. I don't know. Goofed off with some bastard with a bottle." Randy called, "Bill, where's Bill?" Bill McGovern was on the other side of the truck, and he said, "I'm here, Randy." "Bill, go look in that car and see if you can find Dan's bag. And be sure those two back there are good and dead." Malachi choked again, and Randy tried to ease him over on his side, but he began to bleed more from the stomach wound, so he had to let him be. Sam Hazard said, "I don't think this one's doing us any good. He's just holding us up. I think we should convoke a military tribunal right now and pass sentence. I vote he be executed." "So do I," Randy said, "but I want him to hang. If he makes any trouble, let him have it, Sam, but I'd like to have him alive." Bill came back with a cardboard carton. Nothing in the car except for this, a little food in here, a few cans of sardines and corned beef hash, and a box of matches, a couple boxes of ammunition, that's all. Not a sign of Dan's bag, and the sedan is finished. It was in our line of fire, and it looks like a sieve with all that buckshot through it. There's gasoline all over the road. Randy started the Model A and looked at the fuel gauge. It showed almost empty. He backed it away from the bridge entrance and put the key in his pocket and left it. He said, "We'll lift Malachi into the truck and get going. First, I'll collect their weapons and ammo." He was thinking ahead. There would be other highwaymen, and this would be armament for his company. "What about these?" Bill asked, pointing his shotgun at the bodies. "Leave them." He looked up. The buzzards already attended. "I'll come back tomorrow, or we'll send somebody." Whatever. They leave. He watched the blackbirds wheeling, swooping. "We'll give to the river." One of the highwaymen trailing them had been Leroy Settle, the drugstore cowboy. When Randy examined his two guns, he was surprised to find that they were only .22 caliber lightweight replicas, except in bore of the big Frontier .45s. His companion's pistol apparently had gone into the river, for it wasn't on the bridge, although he had a pocket full of ammunition. Then Randy leaned over the leader. He saw that his shots had all been good, that the three in the belly making a neat pattern, a diagonal tic-tac-toe, and when he picked up the Thompson, the dead man's arm astonishingly rose with it, clinging as if his finger were glued to the stock, and Randy jerked it free and saw that it was glue of a sort. The man's hands were smeared with honey. It was after dark when Randy wheeled up the front steps of the house. As he cut the engine, he heard Graff barking. All the downstairs windows showed light, and Lib burst out of the door and ran down the steps and saw him at the wheel and was there with her arms and lips when he got out. Preacher Henry appeared, and Two-Tone, Florence Weechek, and Alice Cooksey, Hannah and Missouri, the children. Dan Gunn came out, robe flapping, carrying a lantern. They had all been waiting. The Admiral and Bill were in back with the prisoner and Malachi, and Bill stepped out, holding a pistol, and then the man with the bat, called Casey, prodded by Sam Hazard's shotgun. Sam climbed down, and that left Malachi. Malachi had been unconscious after the first mile, until they reached Fort Repose, and the road had been very bad. Randy said, "Killed 3, grabbed this one. They got Malachi through the middle. Look at him, Dan. Is he still with us, Sam?" The Admiral said, "He was a minute ago. Barely." Randy said, "Ben Franklin, get some clothesline." "Are we going to hang him right now?" Ben asked. Not casually, but still as if he expected it. "No, we'll tie him." Dan crawled into the truck, and he held up the lantern and shook his head in exasperation and then tore the patch away from his right eye. The eye was still swollen, but not entirely shut, and any assistance to his left eye would be helpful. He crawled out and said, "He's in shock and he shouldn't be moved, and he ought to have a transfusion, but we have to move him if I'm to do anything at all." "On what?" There was a discarded door in the tool house, and they moved him on that. They laid Malachi on the billiard table in the game room, and then amassed lamps and candles so that Dan could have light. Dan said, I have to go into him. Massive internal hemorrhaging. I've got to tie it off or there's going to be no chance at all. How? With what? He leaped on the edge of the table, swaying, not in fatigue or weakness, but in agony and frustration, and he cried, Oh, God! And Dan stopped swaying. A knife, Randy. My hunting knife, the one I shave with. It's sharp as a razor, almost. No, too big, too thick. How about steak knives? Sure, steak knives. The short-bladed steak knives even looked like lancets. The judge and Randy's mother had bought the set in Denmark on their summer in Europe in '54, and they were the finest, sharpest steak knives Randy had ever used, and he found them in the silver chest. How many? 2 will do. From the dining room, Helen called, I've put on a pot of water to boil, a big pot. The dinner fire had been going, and Helen had piled on fat wood so it roared, and Dan would soon have the means of sterilizing his instruments. Randy put them in the pot to boil, and after that, at Dan's discretion, he put in his fine-nosed fishing pliers. Florence Weechek ran across the road for darning needles. Liv found metal hair clips that would clamp an artery, and Randy's 6-pound nylon line off the spinning wheel could do for sutures. There was enough soap to cleanse Dan's hands. Dan went into the dining room, fretting, waiting for the pot and his instruments to boil, and it was hopeless, he knew. In spite of everything they might do, sepsis was almost inevitable. But now it was the shock and the hemorrhage that he couldn't lick, and he wondered whether it would be possible to rig up a saline solution transfusion. They had the ingredients, salt, water, and fire, and somewhere, certainly, rubber tubing. He would not give up on Malachi. He wanted to save Malachi, capable, quiet, and strong, more than he had ever wanted to save anyone in his years as a physician. So many people had died for nothing, and Malachi was dying for something. In the game room, Helen was at work, quick and competent, and she had found their last bottle of scotch, except what might remain, in Randy's decanter upstairs, and was cleansing the wound with it. Randy and Liv stood beside her. The pool of blood in the round hole ebbed and did not rise again. The water was boiling in the big iron pot when Randy walked into the dining room and touched Dan's shoulders. I'm sorry, he said. I'm afraid it's all over. In a dark corner of the room, where she thought she would be out of the way and not a bother, Hannah Henry had been sitting in an old, scarred maple rocker. And the rocker began to move in slow cadence, and she moaned in this cadence for the dead. Arms folded over her empty breasts as if holding a baby, except where the baby had been there was nothing. Dan Gunn went into the game room and saw that Randy was correct, that Malachi was gone. His shoulders felt heavy. He was aware that his head throbbed and eyes burned. There was nothing more to do except empty the makeshift sterilizer with its ridiculous makeshift tools. He did this in the kitchen sink. Yet, when he saw the knives and pliers and the hair clips steaming, he realized that they really were not so ridiculous. If he was very careful and skillful, he could make do with such tools. They had not, and probably could not have saved Malachi, but they might save someone else. A century ago, the tools had been no better, and the knowledge infinitely less. Out of death, life, an immutable truth. Helen was at his side. He said, "Thanks, Helen, for the try. You're the best unregistered nurse in the world." I'm sorry, it was for nothing. Maybe it wasn't for nothing. I'll just keep these and try to add to them. I wonder if we could find a small bag somewhere. Any little traveling bag would do. I have one, a train case. We'll start here then and build another kit. His eyes hurt. Who in Fort Repose could build him another pair of glasses or give him new eyes? At 9 o'clock that night, Randy's knees began to quiver and his brain refused further work and begged to quit, a reaction he knew to the fight on the bridge and what had gone on before and after, and lack of sleep. It was his wedding night, and he had been married at noon that same day, which seemed incredible. Noon was a lifetime ago. But now that they were married, he thought it only right that he and Lib have a room to themselves, and the privacy accorded a married couple. All the bedroom spaces were taken, and he hated to evict anyone. After all, they were all his guests. Yet, since it was inevitable that beds and rooms be shifted around, the victim would have to be Ben Franklin, since Ben was the junior male. Ben would have to give up his room and take the couch in Randy's apartment, and Mr. and Mrs. Randolph Bragg would move into Ben's room. And he was sitting on the couch, trying to still his quivering legs, face in his hands, and thinking of this, and Lib sat behind the bar drinking a warm limeade. She was thinking of the problem also, but was reluctant to mention it, feeling that it was the husband's duty, and she should allow him to bring it up. Her father came in, a thin and wan Caesar, in his sandals and white robe. Bill McGovern had been standing guard over the trussed prisoner, wondering the while that he had killed a man that day and felt no guilt at that time or after. It was like stepping on a roach. He had just been relieved by Two-Tone Henry, who had left his house of mourning to assume the duty. Bill asked for Dan, and Randy lifted his head and told him that Dan, exhausted by being too long on his feet, slept. Well, I'll tell you then, but I don't suppose it will do any good tonight. He spoke directly to his daughter. I didn't know what to give you for a wedding present, Elizabeth. There's a good deal of real estate in Cleveland, but I don't suppose it'll ever be worth much now. There are bonds and stock certificates in our safe deposit vaults here in Fort Repose, and cash, well, the Confederate money in Randy's chest is just as good. You can have the house and property down the road if you want it, but I don't think anybody can ever live there unless electricity comes back. So I thought, what can I give Lib and Randy? I talked it over this morning with Dan, and he made a suggestion, and we decided to give you a present jointly from the best man and the father of the bride. Bill looked from one to the other and saw that they were interested. We are jointly making you a present of this whole apartment. Dan is going to move in with me. Lib said, "Oh, that's perfectly wonderful, Father." Bill said hesitantly, "Only, if Dan's asleep, I don't think we ought to disturb him, do you?" "No, not tonight," Lib said, and she kissed her father, and she kissed her husband, and she went across the room to her old room, and Randy fell across the couch and slept, and presently Graff jumped up beside him and snuggled under his arm. At noon, Monday, the man with the bat was hung from a girder supporting the bandstand roof in Marines Park. All the regular traders and a number of strangers were in the park, and Randy ordered that the corpse not be cut down until sunset. He wanted the strangers to be impressed and spread the word beyond Fort Repose. While he had not planned it, on this day he accepted the first enlistments in what would become known as Bragg's troop. although in orders he called it the Fort Repose Provisional Company. 7 men volunteered that day, including Fletcher Kennedy, who had been an Air Force fighter pilot, and Link Haslip, a West Point cadet, who had been home on Christmas leave on the day. He created them provisional lieutenants of infantry, and the other 5 were younger boys who had just finished 6 months of reserve training after high school or had been in the National Guard. After the execution, Randy posted the notices he had typed earlier and brought to the park in his uniform pocket. The first read, "On 17 April, the following highwaymen were killed on the covered bridge. Mickey Kahane of Las Vegas and Boca Raton, a gambler and racketeer. Arch Flegert, Miami, occupation unknown. Leroy Settle, Fort Repose." On 18 April, Thomas Casey Killinger, also of Las Vegas, and the 4th member of the band which murdered Mr. and Mrs. James Hickey and robbed and assaulted Dr. Daniel Gunn, was hung on this spot. The second notice was shorter. On 17 April, Technical Sergeant Malachi Henry, USAF Reserve, died of a wound received on the covered bridge while defending Fort Repose.